start to identify how these proteins cycle.
It's estimated that by the middle of the century,
actually makes your stress hormones go down faster.
Welcome to Brainwaves, a podcast about big ideas produced at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Paul Bake. This week, climate change is a politically hot topic for sure. A recent Gallup poll found a 12-year high of Americans feel the government isn't doing enough on the environment. Not a total surprise here. We found more or less the same thing on the 29th Street Mall in Boulder last week.
I think it's real. I think it's happening, and it's making this crazy, crazy weather, and it kind of sucks.
Don't know too much. It's nitty-gritty stuff, but it's a problem.
It is happening despite what people say, and it's very upsetting because we need to do something.
It's happening. I think it's hard to deny it. We've seen the big changes in temperature and the irregular weather patterns we've seen throughout this entire spring, and the extremes that we saw with the winter we had in Colorado, and then how hot it is now. It's just something's changing.
But even if you don't believe in climate change, it's going to affect you either way. The things we build and make were designed for a world where certain things are a given. Things like gravity, exposure to the elements, and of course weather. So if the weather changes drastically, what happens to that infrastructure? For answers, we turn to a CU Boulder professor who's looking into that very question. Joining us now is Paul Janowski, the director of the program in environmental design at CU Boulder. Paul, welcome to Brainwaves.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What do you think it will take for the public and lawmakers to understand the link between infrastructure and climate change?
I'm hoping it's not going to take some type of disaster. I mean, that's truly my hope. But I think the big thing is it's going to take the average person talking about it more. It's people going to their city council meetings, people going to their state legislatures and really talking about it. This is also public health. It's tied to both infrastructure. So infrastructure covers things like schools and hospitals and cooling stations. Well, if you think about heat, we all relate to temperature. When it gets really hot, vulnerable populations are really affected. How are we going to design some adaptation for that? Where are people going to go to cool down in August? So infrastructure is really tied to public health, whether it's kids going to school, making sure the schools are cooled, or whether it's senior citizens having cooling centers. So they're tied together. We need to think of infrastructure not just as standing by itself, but it really does affect the quality of life in our community.
You were co-author on a recent paper that suggests that railroads in the United States will be vulnerable to delays and other costs from rising temperatures. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, railroads are one of the really hidden problems that we've got in the U.S. Rails are actually designed for a very narrow band of temperature that they work well in. When it gets hotter, they essentially get warp. They call them sun kinks. And when rails warp, you cannot run, obviously, rail cars over them. And it turns out that the majority of our rail system is going to be very susceptible to increased temperatures, which means that most of the heavy things, whether it's appliances or cars, all travel by rail once they get to ports. And that means a lot of delays as we can't move this heavy materials from one place to another in the middle of the day. Luckily, we can use technology with the advances in heat sensors that we have. We can at least pinpoint where the problems are so we don't have to shut down 100 miles of track. We can say, well, there's a problem in these 5 miles.
You developed software that analyzes the impact of climate change on infrastructure. It's used by the World Bank and the UN, among others. How important is it that architecture and engineering students understand climate science?
It's a great question. It really is the new thing about having to figure out what you're going to design for. When we traditionally look at codes or standards, we're looking for what are we designing for in the past? It's the past 40 years. Climate science is saying we have a whole new reality ahead of us. Students need to learn that we're planning for the future, not for the past. And that really changes the way we teach.
You teach a course that emphasizes the use of climate projections on a particular area. What have you and your students learned about building in or improving areas that are susceptible to the effects of climate change?
What we've learned, and really what the students have taken away from it, is that things are going to be different in different localities. So what I mean by that is it's going to be much hotter in the Southwest. It's going to be wetter in the Southeast. So when they look at different areas, they start learning that what they thought they were going to design may not work. And they have to start bringing in principles from things that they would never have thought of. Denver all of a sudden starts using design principles from New Mexico. And so they start learning that what previously they looked at may not always work, and they have to think a little differently.
Paul Chanowski, thank you very much for joining us today on Brainwaves.
Thank you.
Paul Chanowski is the director of the program in environmental design at CU Boulder. If any of that has you worried about climate change, do you do anything about it? Back at the mall, we found some mixed answers to that question.
I mean, I definitely try to recycle as much as I can. I try to ride my bike instead of driving.
I think eating locally, and I think where I'm not using emissions to get my food.
Using more glass bottles, fewer plastic bottles. I mean, there are lots of simple things you can do.
But how that actually plays out in your life may not be up to you. Beyond the temperatures you deal with every day, climate change could even mess with the price of your house. Let's do a thought experiment. You're an investor. You don't necessarily know or care if climate change is real, but you know that other people do believe in it. What do you do with your money? Turns out that's a very real scenario we're seeing in coastal real estate across the country. Joining us now on Brainwaves is Assistant Professor of Finance at the Leeds School of Business, Asaf Bernstein. Asaf, welcome to Brainwaves.
Thank you so much.
You've done research on the impact of rising sea levels on the cost of real estate. What is the basic result of your research?
What we find is that nationwide, on average, there's a 7% discount for properties exposed to 6 feet of sea level rise. That average hides some more interesting pieces as well, which is that for the average owner-occupied property, so this is the average person we think of buying a house and living in it, we actually find no effect on average for the value of a house exposed to that risk, that our effect is being driven by some areas of the country where those sorts of buyers are more concerned about sea level rise, and buyers who purchase properties without the intention to live in them, predominantly investment properties, and what we call relatively sophisticated buyers in those markets. What we do is we compare properties that look otherwise identical in these communities that transact around the same time, and then look at their relative prices. The biggest challenge here is that properties that are right near the beach are also really nice properties, right? So on average, if we look at properties that are right near the coast, which are the ones who also have higher exposure to sea level rise, they're worth a lot more, right? But that, of course, is not because people really, really value having a flex swim space in their living room. It's because it's a beautiful view and it's nice to be near the beach. So what do? We take properties that are about the same distance from the beach, that are in the same zip code, that are approximately the same elevation, the same number of bedrooms, same number of bathrooms, same-ish square footage, and then we say, let's look at those properties, but where they still differ on how much sea level rise it would take to put them underwater, and then ask what's the difference in the price of those properties. And that's the key methodology we're using to distinguish sea level rise from any of these other sort of possibilities that exist out there.
The buyers of these homes are factoring in the risk, and the prices of the homes are not rising as fast as other homes. Is that accurate?
Yes, I would say that's an accurate assessment. But what we're trying to do here is a bit more of what we would call revealed preferences in economics. So do people put their money where their mouth is, right? So not just are they concerned, but here in what for most households is the largest financial transaction they're going to make in their lives, is it actually influencing their behavior? And so how we're looking at that is by looking at prices. Prices tell us a lot about what people expect to happen in the future, which is how we ended up looking at house prices. So this is one of those rare markets where there's evidence that people really seem to care about the value of their house way down the road.
Asaf Bernstein, thank you very much for joining us on Brainwaves today. Asaf Bernstein is an assistant professor of finance at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado Boulder. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time when we take a look at another hot topic, cannabis. I'm Paul Bake. This episode of Brainwaves was produced by Cole Hemstreet and myself. Andrew Sorensen is our executive producer.